near Dunfermline in Scotland, is the home of the Bruce family. On the 700th anniversary of the birth of King Robert the Bruce, the present chief, the Earl of Elgin, invited Scottish historian Ian Grimble to talk about the long history of one of the country's oldest families.
Since the beginning of recorded history, people have organized themselves in tribes. Sometimes these tribes have fallen under the control of a higher power, like the Roman Empire or the British Empire. And then people have often forgotten their older, more personal loyalties. But not the Scots. Although they found themselves citizens first of a kingdom of Scotland, then of a united kingdom of Great Britain, and finally of a worldwide empire, many parts of which are long separated from the mother country, millions of Scots all over the world still feel the ancient tribal loyalties that gave pride and a measure of security to their ancestors centuries ago. Tribes are bound together by descent from a common ancestor, a figure who becomes increasingly legendary with the passage of time until sometimes he's thought to have been a god or even the sun or the moon. All his descendants are his children, and the Gaelic for children is clan, which comes to be pronounced clan in English. But very few Bruces have ever spoken Gaelic, and the Bruces in Scotland are not a clan in the narrow Highland Gaelic sense of the word. And their ancestor is not a mythical figure. He's a man of flesh and blood, a product of the remarkable human stock that was bred in Normandy 1,000 years ago. It was a cross between two very sturdy strains. The Viking Norsemen who sailed south to raid and then to settle in the country that's been named after them, the land of the Northmen, Normandy, and these intermarried with the Franks, a people who'd shown their mettle earlier by halting the Muslim invasion when it had swept up through Europe halfway through the country that's named after them, France. And it's very important to notice how they did this, because the tribal ancestor usually had some special skill, something that made his remote descendants sometimes think that he was superhuman. And it was a special skill of the Norsemen and the Franks that the Bruce ancestor inherited. They used a metal stirrup to fight on horseback, and they bred horses large enough to carry a man weighted down with heavy metal weapons and armor. In fact, when William the Conqueror crossed the Channel to fight in the Battle of Hastings in 1066, he's thought to have brought no less than 14,000 of these great horses in transports with him. And one of his horsemen was a Norman noble called Robert. He came from a castle on a hill by a river on the Cherbourg Peninsula at Breeks, that tongue of land which points like a finger towards the coast of England. And after the Battle of Hastings, Robert of Breeks received lands in the North Riding of Yorkshire, and a brother of his who come over too received lands in Sussex, where his descendants were to live for centuries to come. And now we want to notice a consequence of the fact that the Bruce ancestor was a warrior horseman, because most tribes have always had their rallying symbol, something like the colours of regiments in more modern times that are always, you know, treated with great veneration. Sometimes this would be an animal on which the tribe depended for its prosperity. Sometimes an animal notorious for its fierceness and valor. For instance, there's a whole confederation of Highland clans that are called in Gaelic to this day the Children of the Cat. And in fact, the Bruce device is also another of these animals notorious for its fierceness. But because the ancestor was a Norman horseman, it had a particular origin all its own. You see, when these warriors were identified in battle, they had a cloth draped over the flanks of their horses, painted with a simple device, rather like the modern tank badge. And of course, the medieval horse was the modern tank. And this device which identified them was painted on their shield as well, so they could be recognized from in front. And it was called a coat of arms. Actually, they liked wearing a device on the tops of their helmets as well, which came to be called a crest. But it was some time before they stopped changing their crests, because they seemed to enjoy doing that, the way people nowadays like changing their ties for some special occasion. And the device which the Bruce ancestor brought to this country was a blue lion. And when Robert of Breeks died, he was succeeded and in his lands and in his coat of arms by his eldest son. The way in which the first Bruce ancestor reached Scotland was this. The Bruce family were closely connected in England with the youngest son of the King of Scots, David, who lived on the English properties of the Scottish royal family. It was quite usual in those days, before nation states had really come into existence, for people to have properties, top people, in various countries. And in fact, David was the premier baron of England before he inherited the Scottish crown. When he did, he took the younger son of Robert of Breeks, Robert Bruce, to Scotland with him and made him Lord of Annandale, where he defended the borders in the southwest of Scotland from Lochmaben Castle. And this became the seat of the Bruces in Scotland for generations to come. And it's interesting that when the Bruces went to Scotland, they changed their device. It was then they adopted the saltire in the bottom half of their coat of arms. In fact, the lion was dropped altogether for a time, until finally it came back. And this is the device of the chiefs of the Bruces in Scotland to this day. Among junior branches of the Bruces in Scotland, you find variants of this original ancient device of the family. You can see that in 3 generations, the Bruces have established separate branches in 3 countries. There's the original parent root in Normandy, and there are branches now in England and Scotland. And as time passes, we can't be sure how many Bruces each contains, because the records of that remote period tend to be concerned only with those who inherit property or obtain it. It doesn't usually have to say so much about younger sons of younger sons or illegitimate sons who bear the name of Bruce. They're all assuredly Bruces because the name was not known in the country before the ancestor brought it here. But in the senior stem, we have enough evidence to tell us that the different branches remained very close-knit. They travelled freely between Scotland and England and France and kept in touch with each other, as the Scottish royal house did too, because, for instance, the youngest grandson of David, King of Scots, became Earl of the same English properties that his grandfather had possessed in England before he inherited the Scottish crown. And when this Earl of the Scottish royal house died, leaving only 3 daughters, why, Robert Bruce, the 4th Lord of Annandale, married one of those daughters, not the eldest one. But in so doing, he made himself on the one hand a member of the Scottish royal house, and on the other hand a subject of the King of England for all those very extensive properties he inherited through this royal heiress. And this was to have grave consequences when the senior line of the Scottish kings gradually died out, until a time came when there was a King of Scots who had no son to succeed him. And Robert Bruce, the 5th Lord of Annandale, was named heir presumptive. That is, heir unless and until a senior claimant should be born. And in fact, the Bruce claim was extinguished when Robert Bruce of Annandale's mother's elder sister had a grandson called John Balliol. But when the King of Scots died in 1286, there was still one descendant of the senior line left, and that was his granddaughter Margaret, the girl we remember as the Maid of Norway. And the Scottish magnates recognized her as the rightful queen and invited her to come to her kingdom, all except Robert Bruce of Annandale. He, I'm sorry to say, tried to pinch Margaret's crown, and the Scottish magnates appealed to her uncle, Edward of England, to protect her rights, and Robert Bruce was compelled to drop his claim. And then Margaret died on her way back to her kingdom. And now the only serious claimants to the Scottish crown were all English subjects. And so the Scottish magnates invited King Edward to arbitrate between them. And he quite rightly chose John Balliol as King of Scots. Perhaps Robert Bruce would have made a better king. He was certainly able enough for King Edward to appoint him the first Chief Justice of England. But it's likely that, in fact, nobody could have made a success of it, because by this time King Edward had decided to set himself up himself as the ruler of Scotland, to subdue Scotland just as he'd subdued Wales. He called himself Lord Paramount of Scotland, and he interfered in the government so much that in the end John Balliol revolted and was deposed, and King Edward embarked on direct rule. Now, you'd have thought that in these circumstances the Bruces would either have pulled out of Scotland altogether to their ample English properties, or would have aided and abetted King Edward in his Scottish plans. And in fact, the rather colourless son of Robert Bruce, the competitor, seems to have spent most of his life trying to decide which of those two things to do. The miracle of the Bruce story is that the competitor should have had a grandson, Robert, the future king, out of such an unpromising background, who was to be the saviour, if not the creator, of the Scottish nation. In accounting for this, it's important to notice one factor apart from the personal genius of the future king, which I think was of decisive importance. He belonged to the first generation of Bruces to possess the blood of the ancient native aristocracy of Scotland. Because whereas William the Conqueror had killed off the native aristocracy of England, the last English earl was done to death during his reign, the coming of the Normans to Scotland was relatively peaceful. And in fact, for long after the first Robert Bruce became Lord of Annandale, every earl in Scotland belonged to the ancient royal and noble Celtic houses. But of course you got a failure of the male heirs. And it was in these circumstances that the rather colourless son of the competitor Bruce married the heiress of the old earldom of Carrick in southwest Scotland. And so it came about that their son, Robert the future king, was born in Turnberry Castle on the coast of Ayrshire and brought up by a mother belonging to that network of the ancient aristocracy of the country. What else he would be heir to, apart from her earldom of Carrick, of course, was uncertain. When King John Balliol was deposed, the competitor's colourless son, the competitor by this time being dead, went to King Edward and asked if he could have the Scottish crown. And Edward snapped back, "Do you think I've got nothing better to do than to win kingdoms to give to you?" Actually, King John Balliol had a son. He also had a nephew, and both of them had a very much better claim than any Bruce to the Scottish crown if King Edward had been disposed to restore a King of Scots. But the Balliol line hadn't got one thing. That rather colourless Bruce and his wife, the Countess of Carrick, had 5 very remarkable sons as well as 7 daughters, and by now it was going to require a great deal more than hereditary descent to restore a kingdom of Scotland. William Wallace tried to do it with other patriots, invoking, of course, the authority of the deposed King John Balliol. There was no other authority they could have invoked, and I need hardly say that the rather futile Bruce did nothing whatever to help them. But he died in the year 1304, the year in which King Edward came and conquered Scotland again, leaving his son Robert, the future king, Earl of Carrick, Lord of Annandale, and heir to all those vast possessions in England. And he was down in London and saw King Edward return, thinking that at last he'd conquered Scotland for good. He saw Wallace brought down a prisoner, tried in Westminster Hall and executed with extreme barbarity. And well might he have contemplated the appalling fate to which he was exposing himself and his entire family when, instead of settling down to the cosy life that was now open to him, he threw it all away and went back to Scotland to rescue his country from English rule. His first task was to try and come to terms with the senior representative of the Balliol family still in the country. This was John Cummin, who was the greatest magnate in the realm. Unfortunately, they'd quarrelled before, but perhaps they could agree now, especially in a consecrated church. They didn't, they quarrelled again, and Robert Bruce slew the Red Cummin at the altar. And it was the first disaster of his campaign, because it made enemies of a whole network of the most powerful families in Scotland, and it placed him under the ban of excommunication for sacrilegious murder for the remainder of his life, and that was extremely serious in the Middle Ages. But nothing could stop him now. He went to school. King Edward had removed the coronation stone down to Westminster Abbey, where it still lies. He'd also made a captive of the man who, by hereditary right, crowned a King of Scots. But at Scone, without the stone, King Robert was crowned by this man's sister, the Countess of Buchan, in the presence of 2 bishops, an abbot, 2 earls, and that's how King Robert became the first Bruce, King of Scots, in March 1306. And disasters followed thick and fast. He was totally routed near Perth, and as he retired to the west, he was defeated again in the pass that runs down from Tyndrum to Loch Orb. King Robert had placed his wife, his 12-year-old daughter Marjorie, and 2 of his sisters in the care of his brother Neil, who'd taken them up to the great fortress of Kildrummy in the depths of Aberdeenshire for safety. And when an English army came to get them there, Neil sent his womenfolk north to the sanctuary of St. Duach at Tain in Rossshire, and none of them escaped. The garrison at Kildrummy had to surrender when somebody set fire to the corn in the Great Hall, and Neil was taken away a captive and executed, the first of the Bruce brothers to perish. The women were dragged out of the sanctuary at Tain, and it's King Edward's treatment of them which disfigures his record as a great king more than any of his other cruelties in Scotland. But he took one of Bruce's sisters and he had her suspended from a cage. The Countess of Buchan, who'd crowned King Robert, was suspended from another cage from the outer walls of Berwick Castle. And King Edward actually ordered the 12-year-old daughter Marjorie should be suspended from a similar cage from the walls of the Tower of London. But I'm glad to say that when he recovered from his fit of fury, he put her in a nunnery instead. And he put the other sister of King Robert, whom he'd captured, in another nunnery. And actually he treated Bruce's wife, the Queen of Scots, with relative decency. After all, he'd separated her from her husband before she'd borne him a son to succeed him. That black autumn, King Robert escaped from the mainland, and nobody knows for certain where he spent the winter, though there are some very likely guesses. But in February he returned, and this is when 2 more of his brothers perished. They were defeated and captured and again taken away and executed. And one of them was Alexander, who'd been one of the best scholars at Cambridge University and was probably the ablest of all the Bruce brothers apart from the king. Now there were only 2 left, King Robert himself and his brother Edward. And of all 5, none had produced a legitimate son to succeed to the Scottish crown. But this can work both ways. As King Edward, the Hammer of the Scots, returned north in that summer of 1307 to conquer the country yet again, he died, and he had got a son to succeed him, the worthless King Edward II. From now on, it was just a matter of time before King Robert Bruce would sweep the last English garrison from the land. And what people remember best about those years in which he was forging the new nation of Scotland was his indomitable patience. Everybody knows the story that was told to illustrate it, of how he sat in the cave watching the patience of a spider spinning its web. And also his fantastic personal courage. He would be first up the scaling ladders when they were assaulting a castle. He'd plunge up to his neck in the ice-cold water of a moat to test its depth before ordering his men to follow. He risked his life at every step, although it was the only life on which the future of his country depended. Because by now he must have taken the measure of his brother Edward and realized that he lacked certain essential qualities for the task. It came out very clearly later when Edward Bruce perished in Ireland, and the first intimation of it came in the events which led up to the showdown at Bannockburn. King Robert had learned from harsh experience to avoid pitched battles with the English at all costs, and to depend instead on guerrilla tactics and assaults on individual garrisons. And this had paid off so well that in the end, the only really important position of strength the English still occupied in Scotland was Stirling Castle. And when it proved to be impregnable, Edward Bruce went to the commander and made an agreement with him that he'd surrender Stirling Castle if it were not relieved by the English by Midsummer's Day, 1314. This was exactly the kind of challenge King Robert had learned to avoid. It gave the English ample time to bring a great army to Scotland, and worse still, to bring with them the tank weapon which the Scots didn't possess. The great horse which Scotland was still too poor to find fodder for. All King Robert had was a detachment of the light Scottish horse, which was probably something like the modern Highland Garran. Did the descendant of the warrior horseman at Hastings think of King Harold there as he watched the approach of 3,000 of England's heavy cavalry and the archers that rained death from the skies on the foot soldiers who stood there to withstand their shock? At least he knew that never in Europe had a battle been won by infantrymen against those horsemen. Certainly the king was undecided whether or not to fight. But first there was that characteristic act of courage when he rode out between the two armies on his little horse and split the skull of the knight who charged him on his big horse, raising himself in his stirrups to get at his helmet with his battle axe. And then there was the early success of the Scottish foot soldiers in their hedgehogs, standing in a ring with their lances pointing outwards as the English horsemen charged them. During the night, King Robert decided he would stand and fight. And then there was his masterly ordering of the main battle on the next day, when the English horses were all cramped together so they couldn't maneuver properly, when the archers couldn't do their job, and finally when the English infantry were trampled down in the general rout. And then what was so much remarked upon at the time, there was the king's magnanimity, when he refused to allow a general slaughter to take place, in spite of what had been done to him and his family and his country for so many years. It was 10 years after Bannockburn before his son David was born. It was 14 years after before he compelled the English to recognize him as independent King of Scots. But it was Bannockburn which laid the foundations on which he spent the entire remainder of his life building the new Scottish nation. But although his work endured, his dynasty proved to be short-lived. His son, King David II, had no children, and so the crown passed through Marjorie Bruce to the Stuarts. And the clan which had possessed a royal chief now possessed no chief at all. And we know far less than we'd like to about other members of the Bruce family during this period. You see, nearly 30 years elapsed between the death of the last king of the senior line and the Battle of Bannockburn. And during that time, King Edward of England removed all the public records out of Scotland, and most of them have never been seen since. Anyway, in a time of troubles, it usually happens that the records become somewhat scanty. Now, the other thing that happens is the illegitimacy rate generally goes up, and it's perhaps symptomatic that King David was the only legitimate son of all those 5 Bruce brothers. Edward had 3 illegitimate sons who succeeded one another as the last 3 Earls of Carrick, and one of those sons had other children. King Robert himself had an illegitimate son, Sir Robert Bruce, whom he made Lord of Liddesdale. But when King David II placed one of his blood relations, as he described him, in the ancient Bruce property, the castle and barony of Clackmannan, we don't know for certain what his pedigree was. All we can be certain of is that King David would have known who was the senior Bruce when he had to select among the survivors of that appalling period the line which was to represent the Bruce chiefship in the future. The House of Clackmannan soon started putting out new branches of its own. For instance, a younger son married the heiress of Airth, this magnificent castle with its lands flowing down there to the Firth of Forth. And in the massive structures of Clackmannan over there and Airth here, we see how the senior lines of the Bruces passed through those troubled years of the later Middle Ages under Stuart rule. There never were any Wars of the Roses in Scotland as they had in England. Although the king was often a child living under a regency, no one ever took up arms to contest the right of the descendants of Marjorie Bruce to the Scottish crown. But the central government was often weak, and the country was frequently menaced by English invasion. And it's precisely in such circumstances as these that people fall back on ancient tribal loyalties and hope that a local magnate will protect them against the results of an ineffectual, distant government. Here at Airth, the law was laid down in baronial courts. Local officers were appointed. Food was distributed in hard times, and men were called up for military service. And fortunate the man who could approach the gates and announce that his name was Bruce. And Airth, in its turn, started putting out its own new branches. For instance, a younger son of the first Edward Bruce of Airth went to France, and he was rewarded for his valor there with a French lordship, though he may have returned to die among his kinsfolk on the battlefield of Flodden in 1513. And the great-grandson of the founder, Robert Bruce of Airth, reminded the English what his name stood for when he defended Edinburgh Castle against an English invasion. And he's the father of Sir Alexander of Airth, the lavish, full-blooded patriarch in whose company we're going to say goodbye to the old Scotland of the Middle Ages, with these great castles and lords living in them who exercised an almost independent authority. By contrast, the sons of Sir Alexander were the children of a new age. There were 5 of them, and believe it or not, 2 of them were called Robert, and one became a Catholic priest, and the other became a Calvinist minister. Robert Bruce, who became a Calvinist minister, is said to have experienced his conversion here at Airth in the Wallace Tower, which is so called because Wallace was said to have captured it about 300 years before in the course of rescuing one of his relatives. And his conversion was away from the teachings of the Catholic Church in favor of the central doctrine of the Reformed Church that the Bible is the whole and sole Word of God. This was when the ministers of the Reformed Church were claiming an independent authority, saying that in Christ's kingdom the king was merely a member like anybody else. Well, having curbed the power of the barons, King James was not going to hand a greater power to the ministers. But when he set out to undermine their pretensions, he found Robert Bruce more troublesome in his new position than ever his father, Sir Alexander of Airth, had been in his old one. There were quarrels, reconciliations at Holyrood House. Once, Robert Bruce reduced the king to tears. The king insisted he should be asked pardon on his knees, and this Robert Bruce would never do. How much greater satisfaction it must have given to King James to cross the waters of the Firth and come here to Culross and visit another of his Bruce cousins of a junior stem of the House of Clackmannan, who placed himself in the van of this new age. His name was George Bruce. Over here is the house he built for himself at Culross. It's the finest example we have from the 16th century of the home of a man who's abandoned the life of his ancestors who lived in castles to devote himself to the more modern pursuits of commerce and coal mining and trade. George Bruce introduced coal mining under the sea. He sank a shaft under the sea to an artificial island offshore, and once when King James was visiting him here, he was taken along that shaft, and when he came up in the offshore island, he let out a cry of treason. He was always afraid of assassination, and he had to be pacified. He thought this was a trick. In addition to coal mining, George Bruce had extensive salt panning works. In fact, he played an enormous part in increasing Scotland's export trade in salt. You have to remember that at this time, meat and fish were preserved in salt, and this commodity was of immense importance for the winter food supply of Europe. It's in the kitchen of George Bruce's house that you can see what a transitional period of architecture this was. After all, this kitchen is indistinguishable from one that you'd see in a medieval castle. It's very like the one in the old castle of Clackmannan, except that it's slightly smaller. That great big fireplace in which you would roast an ox. The masons, in fact, didn't really know how to build any other kind of kitchen than the one they were used to building in castles. The water supply. It comes from a well that stands within the complex of buildings a few feet away the other side of this wall, and it's poured by bucket through that channel, and it passes down this other channel, which is quite close to the great fire, so the stone is warm, and it goes through the wall into the bakehouse, which is the other side of this wall here, where it can then be used for baking. Within the stone building are rooms like this one that are like timber boxes, beautifully painted. The ceiling of this one is particularly interesting because it's something like an upturned boat, and in fact the joists that support the ceiling behind all those paintings are very like ship's timbers. And of course the craftsmen who built a room like this were very much more used to building ships than being ordered to build a room of this kind. And this craft seems to have been transferred to a new technique which has been demanded of them. Privacy, a luxury that very few people had enjoyed in the Middle Ages, whether they lived in castles or not. But it was absolutely essential for a merchant to have privacy, because so much of his professional life was involved in correspondence. And he not only needed privacy for his correspondence, he also needed security. He had to be able to file it away efficiently, somewhere where other people wouldn't be able to inspect it, discover all his trade secrets. And there was something else he needed as well. It was absolutely essential that his correspondence shouldn't be destroyed by fire. So here you see the office of George Bruce with its tiled floor, its stone walls, stone ceilings, and two metal doors holding it. And when you consider these surroundings, it's easy to understand how all the earliest diaries in the English language were written by merchants, because it was in this sort of environment that they had the leisure and the privacy to start putting down their private thoughts without interruption, where nobody else would be able to inspect them. And so we come to the events that have resulted in the fact that the present chief is Earl of Elgin and Kincardine, because the son of Lord Bruce was created Earl of Elgin, and the grandson of Sir George of Couros was created Earl of Kincardine. Ultimately, the two titles became united in the same person. And that, of course, is why the present chief has the portraits of both lines in his home here at Broom Hall. Both were the creations of King Charles I, the son of James VI, a sovereign who failed to govern his kingdoms to the satisfaction of his subjects in either, till in fact they rose in rebellion, and at the end of the Civil War, which the king lost, he was executed by the English. The Scots were understandably angry, because although they themselves had started the war, they weren't consulted about the death of the king. And after all, he was a Stuart, he was their king. And they responded by crowning his son as King of Scots. And they were defeated by Cromwell for their pains, and Scotland was placed under English military government. And this is when a nephew of Lord Bruce and his brother Sir George of Couros plays an extremely adroit part in affairs. His father and his grandfather were both called Robert Bruce, needless to say, but he'd been named William as a respite, and he formed a very useful acquaintance with one of the English generals who conquered Scotland, General Monk, who stayed on to govern the country afterwards. And William Bruce used his influence with General Monk after Cromwell's death to persuade him to restore King Charles. And Monk sent William Bruce to The Hague, to Holland, to the exiled court of King Charles, to invite him back. And there he found his cousin, the second Earl of Kincardine. Actually, the two cousins had had a clandestine relationship throughout the Republican period. They'd been plotting this throughout. And while William Bruce was carrying Monk's invitation to Holland, Monk himself had gone down to Coldstream on the Scottish border, picked up a body of troops there, marched it down to London, evicted the Republican government, and arranged for the return of the king. And after the Restoration, Monk was made a duke, and William Bruce a baronet. I'm not sure what the moral of that is. However, it's for something very different that Sir William Bruce is remembered today. He was a pioneer of the architecture which caused Edinburgh to be named long after his death the Athens of the North. And although he was only an amateur, his buildings are well worthy of the man who blazed the trail for the Adam brothers. We may regret today that his influence helped to kill the purely Scottish style of baronial architecture and to put such a foreign model in its place. But he did show his respect for native building when he was invited to restore the palace of Holyrood House. And he balanced those two towers. He balanced that old set of towers with a similar set on the other side of the building. But his masterpiece is the house he built at Kinross, opposite the island in Loch Leven on which Mary Queen of Scots had been imprisoned after her deposition. And now a succession of events occurred which brought ruin to a large number of Scots and immense good fortune to others. In 1688, King James VII, the last Stuart king, was turned off his throne. Of course, a lot of Scots supported him, and they suffered for it. And in 1707, there was the incorporating union with England. Again, a lot of Scots opposed it, and it did them no good. And then in 1745, as a last throw, there was the Jacobite uprising, the ruin of the rebel clans after the defeat of Culloden. Now, the Bruces played a relatively small part in these affairs. The 4th Earl of Elgin did remain loyal to James VII and died in exile for him. But his son accepted the succession of the German kings from Hanover. The 4th Earl of Kincardine, he was very much against the incorporating union with England. And the 7th Earl of Kincardine was a Jacobite. But none of these men did anything that would cause them to be stripped of their possessions, or that brought ruin to their lesser dependents. What in fact imperiled the line of the Bruce chiefs at this time was something quite different. It's always mysterious how families grow enormously for a certain number of generations and then begin to shrivel. The line of Sir William Bruce, the architect, died out altogether. The 7th Earl of Kincardine was the nephew of the 1st Earl. So you can see how many branches have proved barren in between. Then the line of the Earls of Elgin died out altogether, and their earldom passed to the Earls of Kincardine, the year after Culloden, incidentally. Finally, the senior line of Clackmannan, the line of the chiefs, died out too. And so the chiefship and the two earldoms became united in one man. By this time, the Bruces were traveling ever farther afield. Of course, there had always been the Bruces who'd gone abroad to seek their fortunes, like the one who went to France and was ennobled there for his valor. But a cousin of the First Lord Bruce and his brother Sir George is an example of a man whose descendants went much farther afield. There was no reason why they should have. That man had taken the sensible step of marrying a Bruce heiress, and the grandson who went to Barbados shared in that fortune. There in Barbados, he lived and died at about the time, incidentally, when James VII was tipped off his throne. His son became a judge in Barbados. One of his grandsons became a doctor of medicine and died at Connecticut in the United States of America. And one of the cousins of the judge in Barbados went to Europe as a soldier of fortune. He came back with William of Orange when William came to kick James VII off his throne, and he became a general. So you see, there were Bruces on both sides in that conflict too, while others were looking for pastures elsewhere. And now we come to the Bruce who was one of the greatest travellers and explorers in Scottish history. There he is, James Bruce of Kinnaird. He was the descendant of Robert of Airth, the man who'd been such a nuisance to King James VI. And he inherited the same estate of Kinnaird which had been settled on his great-grandfather Robert of Airth. And it was James Bruce's immense good fortune that coal was discovered under the estate of Kinnaird just at about the time when he inherited it. Because this enabled him to realize his life's dream, which was, if you please, to discover the source of the Nile, a mystery that had baffled Alexander the Great and everybody since his time. It was a particularly bad time for anyone to try to solve this mystery, because it involved going to Abyssinia, and no Europeans were allowed into the country. The last Europeans who'd attempted it 70 years before had all been butchered. So how did James Bruce succeed? Well, he was a very large man, 6 feet tall, with an enormous personality. He also had an incredible flair for languages, and he'd mastered the court language of Abyssinia before he ever went there. Goodness knows how, because no one in Europe could speak it. But he had another quality which is central to our story. He looked on himself as a royal Bruce. When he suggested that he ought to put his servants in royal livery because of his descent, he perhaps looked a little ridiculous in Scotland. But when he was among people who were impressed by a man who behaved like a prince in that way, the charm worked. We know it did, because before he ever set foot in Abyssinia, it was rumored that a near cousin of the King of England had come to visit the Abyssinian emperor. And so Bruce was able to spend those years in Gondar, the only European who ever did, before the Gondar dynasty perished and their city with them, when this capital was more unknown to Europeans than even Lhasa in Tibet is to us today. And then he made his incredible journey back into Egypt across the Nubian desert, and that took him nearly a year. And when he reached France, he was given a tremendous reception. He left a lot of the plants that he brought back, which were planted there, and he was sent specimens later. But when he reached his own country, 12 years after he'd left, it was a different story. They said he was making it all up. His story sounded so incredible. And of course it couldn't be checked. But as a last throw, he left an account of his travels, which is, to this day, the supreme epic of African travel. James Bruce returned home in 1774. And that was about the time when the first member of the family inherited not only the earldoms of Elgin and Kincardine, but also the chiefship of the name of Bruce. And with it he inherited the baronial sword of the House of Clackmannan, which was a symbol of the chiefship. It had been for centuries before. This man, the 7th Earl of Elgin, followed James Bruce to the Eastern Mediterranean, and he made his name equally famous there. He was appointed British envoy to Turkey at a time just before Greece had obtained her independence. And when he visited Athens and set eyes on the Parthenon, he determined to rescue the wonderful marble sculpture from that building before it could suffer any more damage. Now, he had to undergo the most terrible storm of abuse for this throughout his lifetime. And there are still people today who say it was an act of vandalism. But people were already looting the Parthenon, and one person had gone about it so incompetently that a whole batch of statuary had come crashing down and been smashed to atoms. There's no saying what would have survived if Elgin hadn't brought home what are now known as the Elgin marbles in time before anything worse occurred. He devoted his entire fortune to this, all the skill he could muster, and it took his estate 70 years to pay the cost of that colossal operation. Most of the Elgin marbles are now in the British Museum. And he's hardly completed his task before the Greek War of Independence broke out, and the Acropolis was besieged, and all those buildings suffered further damage. And now we've entered the 19th century, when the first Hanoverian king, George IV, paid his state visit to Scotland. When he was received in Edinburgh, He came in beneath a banner which proclaimed, "Hail to the descendant of the mighty Bruce." King George wore the kilt on that visit, and this greatly increased the enthusiasm for tartan. And it was only a few years later that a representation was made of the Bruce clan tartan, which is the earliest that survives. So you can see that whereas the coat of arms of the Bruces is of enormous antiquity, the tartan as it's worn today is relatively modern. During the 19th century, Bruces went to the farthest corners of the globe, and the son of Elgin of the Marbles, the 8th Earl, set a conspicuous example. This Earl of Elgin is best remembered today for his monumental services as Governor-General of Canada, when he not only broke the deadlock in the trade relations between Canada and the United States of America, but he also laid the foundations for the responsible government of the Commonwealth of Canada as a self-governing nation. Of course, neither Elgin nor any of his brothers could draw a penny from the family estates, because these were all being used to pay off the colossal debt incurred by the bringing home of the Marbles. And so they all earned their living in the professions. And Elgin himself went as far afield as China and Japan in diplomatic capacities, and he became Viceroy of India. And 3 years before his death, there was born to a junior branch of the Bruces who settled in Wales, a man who was to follow him to India. His name was Charles Bruce, and his father was made Lord Aberdare. And Charles Bruce became an officer in the Gurkha regiment. Gurkhas, you know, are Himalayan peoples, and Charles Bruce spent his entire active service career in the Himalayas. He became the greatest living expert on that country and its peoples. But Charles Bruce had another passion, and that was for mountaineering. Now, this was long before anyone had suggested that Everest could be climbed to its summit. And in fact, Bruce himself was the first to suggest it. And in 1922, his proposal was accepted. And he was invited to undertake an expedition to the mountain. And oxygen was taken there for the first time. By this time, Bruce decided that he was too old to make the assault on the mountain himself. But he was a brigadier general by now with a lot of administrative experience in addition to his intimate knowledge of those mountains. And he organized the expedition down to the last detail. And when it failed, he was invited to undertake another expedition. And in 1924 he did. And this time, two climbers, Mallory and Irvine, were seen above the height of 28,000 feet, going strong for the summit, as someone described it. And to this day, nobody knows for certain whether they reached the summit or not, because they were never seen again. But after Charles Bruce's death, and he died in 1939, his dream came true. And we also have his books about the Himalayas to enjoy, like the book of James Bruce about his African travels. By this time, Bruces had also reached the Antipodes. They were in New Zealand and Australia. And in the year in which Charles Bruce organized his second expedition to Everest, the Prime Minister of Australia was actually a Bruce. And when the Second World War broke out, he was made a member of the British War Cabinet. And so it came about that this time a Bruce was standing beside King Harold himself when a second William the Conqueror tried to take over the country. And as we know, this time the attempt failed. Just before this war broke out, Viscount Bruce of Melbourne, as he later became, was the High Commissioner of Australia in Britain. And he helped to promote a tribal gathering in Scotland that was at the same time a National Assembly of Scots and also a coming together of people throughout the British Empire. And the principal promoter was the chief of the family of Bruce himself, the 10th Earl of Elgin, who was president of the Empire Exhibition. It was his hope to restore confidence and pride to the Scots after years of high unemployment and economic depression. From all corners of the world came men of commerce and industry to help rekindle this flame of future prosperity. And the Countess of Elgin played a novel part in organizing the women of the empire as a separate force. And the emblem that Lord Elgin chose as the rallying symbol was the rampant lion that his family had brought from Normandy so many centuries before. But coloured in tartan now, that comparatively modern symbol of Scottish national pride, and with its claws turned inwards in a gesture of welcome. The Bruce chief had transformed his oldest possession, the military device of the warrior horseman from Breeks, into a symbol of peace. The Bruce family motto is a Latin one, fuimus, which means in English, we have been. And the late chief transformed his family motto too at the exhibition of 1938 into the message to his countrymen, we shall be.
In 1974, the present Earl of Elgin and his far-flung family received the hospitality of the National Trust for Scotland at the historic site of the Battle of Bannockburn.
But there is one thing I think about Bannockburn, that nothing has ever been achieved here without utter discipline. This battle was won by the most disciplined force that Scotland ever knew. It has been preserved by a disciplined determination of the great trust, whose members are here and our hosts this afternoon. And it will be preserved as a living force only by the disciplined determination of all who come in generations to love the place, to understand the meaning, and to go away proud but humble. And on behalf of the members of my family, you have made us today, sir, both proud and humble. And this is the great present that you've given on the 700th anniversary of Robert Bruce's birth. And I think that there's really only one way that we can properly finish off the proceedings, and we should have a song, because we can't really go away just glum, you know. You must join together. And I've got a secret weapon hidden behind the rotunda here, just exactly as there was behind the hill all these centuries ago. And provided it's working, now should be the moment.
Welcome to glory bed or to victory. Knows the day and knows the hour. See the front of battle lower. See approach proud Edward's power. Chains on slavery.